In order to unleash the power that 3ds Max offers as far as reshaping a surface, you'll first need to know something about the little bits and pieces that make up what you've created. Reason being is it'll be those little small components that you'll be manipulating as you sculpt your surface into one shape or another. Max refers to those smaller little pieces of geometry as sub-objects. That's a term we'll be using time and time again over the course of this title. Now, here's how they work. Those little sub-object components connect together to form what you see on the screen. Everything you make will have them, doesn't matter whether you're creating something that's 2D or 3. And what's probably most important to understand is how you get to them. You'll never be able to work on them unless you can find them. Now, here's the trick. In order to get to any of those sub-objects, you've got to be in what Max refers to as sub-object mode. You got that? It's kind of like being below the object. That's where the word sub comes from. If you're not in sub-object mode, you'll never get to nor be able to work on those little sub-object parts. It's that simple. So, how do you get there? How do you get into sub-object mode? Well, that's typically done by adding a certain type of modifier to your geometry, with the type of modifier being determined by whether you're attempting to edit a 3D mesh object or a flat 2D shape. Here's what it boils down to. If you want to edit a 3D mesh, in other words, get to its sub-objects, you'll add an Edit Mesh modifier. If you want to edit a 2D shape, being able to get to its sub-objects, you'll add something called an Edit Spline modifier. That word spline will make more sense in just a moment. So once you're familiar with the terms, it's all pretty straightforward. Why don't we go ahead and identify the sub-object components you'll be working with? We'll start with that by looking at the shape. Now, there are 3 primary names that we'll be working with when dealing with shapes. The first is vertex. A vertex is merely a point in space that typically connects to other sub-object components to form a line or surface. Know that when you're talking about more than one vertex, you'll refer to them as vertices. So use vertex when mentioning one and vertice when talking about more than one. Now, the vertices are connected together by segments, with the length of the segment determining the distance between 2 neighboring verts. Now, when the vertices and segments combine together, they form a line, which Max more specifically refers to as spline. There's that word we just used. So it's the spline that's the overall shape. Know, though, that shapes can actually consist of many splines, all depending on how they've been made. We'll see that in plenty of examples throughout this title. So that's the scoop on 2D sub-object geometry, vertices, segments, and spline, each accessed by way of the Edit Spline modifier. Now, what's up with those 3D objects? Now, when you talk about the sub-object terminology for objects, in other words, things that are 3D, you're going to run into some familiar terminology in addition to some brand new. Now, what shapes and objects have in common are vertices. And like on a shape, a vertex is a point in space that connects to something else to form a larger entity. In the case of an object, vertices are again connected together by lines, but this time around, the lines aren't referred to as segments, they're referred to as edges. In Max, with the majority of things we'll be working on, those vertices and edges come together to form triangles. Triangles that'll then fill in with a skin or surface. That's the reason we can see them. Those triangles are referred to as faces. So here's the bottom line. Edges are connected together by vertices, and as they glue together, they form little triangles called faces. So pretty much everything in Max, geometry-wise, is made up of a bunch of tiny triangular faces. Now, I said pretty much everything. There are a few other geometry types we'll be covering on this title, something called NURBS and something called patches. They use a little different terminology. But the majority of stuff we'll be talking about will be made up of those good old faces, edges, and vertices. Now, one more term you need to be comfortable with is polygon. Maybe you've run across that name before. What a poly is merely a set of faces that consist of 4 or more sides. That's all it is. It's a series of faces that connect together. That's a poly. So there's what you need to know about Max's sub-object components. Get to know those names well. They're essential to the way Max works. Now, in our next video, we're going to take a look at how you go about selecting those sub-objects. Let's get to that.